talking about the marriage and the marriage supper of the Lamb. And our primary text is going to be Revelation chapter 19. This marriage of the Lamb has been so fun to study. You know, when you see things click together that you haven't seen before, it's just kind of neat. And save one for your mother, or you're going to be in trouble. You'll walk home. Okay? So in Revelation 19 and verse 7, John records part of this loud proclamation of a great multitude in heaven. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him. For the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. And concerning the wife of the Lamb, John continues and he says, and to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. And he saith unto me, Right, blessed are they who are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, if we were to do a deep dive into Revelation, and we look at chapter 5, 6, 7, 12 through 15, chapter 17, chapter 19, chapter 21, and chapter 22, one of the things that we clearly find is that the Lamb is Jesus Christ, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, who shed his blood to cleanse sinners. Romans chapter 7, 2 Corinthians 11, Ephesians 5, all indicate that the wife of the Lamb is the church, the New Testament church. So in light of those identifications, the Lamb is Christ, the bride is the church, it's very, very evident that the verses that we just looked at are referring to the marriage of Jesus Christ to the church, and subsequently after that, the celebration of that in the marriage supper. Now, verses 7, 8, and 9 bring up a couple of major questions for us. When and where will the marriage and the marriage supper of the Lamb take place? And there are at least three answers to those questions that have been put forth. First, some suggest that the marriage will occur when the church is raptured to meet Christ in the air at his second coming, and the marriage will take place on earth during the millennium. What would we call that? Post-millennialism. Well, no, not post-tribulationism. Right, okay. The second point that was proffered is that the marriage will occur in heaven when the church is raptured before the 70th week of Daniel, and the marriage supper will take place on earth during the millennium. I don't think there's anything that we call that necessarily. That's just point number two. The third point, or the third suggestion, is that the marriage supper will occur, the marriage will occur in heaven when the church is raptured before the tribulation period, and the marriage supper will take place in heaven during those 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, which is also the tribulation. That's the one we hold to. Okay? And we're going to talk about why. But first we have to understand the connection between Revelation 19 and Jewish marriage customs. There are good reasons for us to be convinced of this third view, but there are some things that we need to understand first and foremost. The terms marriage and marriage supper are related to Jewish marriage customs in Bible times. Secondly, Jewish marriage customs in Bible times involved three major steps. There were three steps to getting married back in those days. The first step was betrothal, engagement, but more than what we think of by engagement today. Engagement back then, you had to get divorced even to break off an engagement. Okay, case in point, Joseph and Mary. So the first step is betrothal. That is the establishment of this marriage covenant that bound the man and the woman together as husband and wife. All right? The second was the taking of the bride or the wife by the groom from her house to his father's house. That's how it was done. The essence of the marriage ceremony and all the celebration was the taking of the bride from her father's house and going to the groom's father's house. And usually that was done at night, about a year or so after the betrothal. And it involved certain things. It involved the consummation of the marriage, all right, through physical union of the bride and the groom. And on the first night at the groom's father's house. And that was the essence of the marriage ceremony. It was regarded as the wedding or the marriage. So the marriage of the Lamb, the taking of the bride, the church, to the Father's house, heaven. All right? Now the third step, after the ceremony and the consummation, was the supper. That was the feast to which guests had already been called. They already had been assembled. Once the marriage had been consummated by the bride and the groom, and the wedding guests were made aware that that had happened, they would feast, and they would make merry, and they would celebrate. And they would do this for 7 days. All right? I don't know about you, but I'm usually ready to leave a wedding celebration about 9 o'clock. Okay? Or earlier. The earlier the better. But sometimes these things drone on for hours and hours, and you're lucky to get out of there by midnight or later. And sometimes it moves from one place to the next place. Okay? But this went on for 7 days. 7 days. Oh my goodness. Mm-hmm. I'll bet he was a Lithuanian Jew. Yep. Very, very true. So 7 days. The marriage supper, the celebration, lasted for a week. And this corresponds to the expression, the marriage supper of the Lamb, in verse 9 of chapter 19 of Revelation. So we can draw a number of conclusions from all of this information, the relationship of these three steps of Jewish custom to the marriage of Christ and the church. First of all, the betrothal of Jesus and the church is taking place now, during the present church age. Okay? We are the bride of Christ. We have been betrothed to Him. He is at the Father's house preparing for us. John chapter 14, right? I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. To do what? To receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And he tells us, in my Father's house are many mansions. I go. All right, so where does he go? He goes to the Father's house. So he's in heaven, and he's preparing for us. So this is what's happening. As people trust Christ to be their Savior, they are betrothed to Christ. Secondly, in the future, Jesus is going to take his bride, the church, from this world to his Father's house in heaven when he comes to rapture it. It's a surprise. Just like when the groom would come, he wouldn't announce it. He wouldn't tell the bride, oh, by the way, sweetie, I'm coming tomorrow night at 10 o'clock. You better have your bells on. Be ready. Okay, no, none of that. It's a surprise. Middle of the night kind of a thing. Hooting and hollering from all the guys, all the groomsmen and everybody. Woo, here we are. And all of her little girls. Oh, he's here. Oh, we better get ready. Ah. Yeah. I don't think I could. Oh, dear. All right. That is going to be the marriage of the Lamb when we are taken. That's it. And then thirdly, after the rapture, the marriage supper is going to take place with the wedding guests who have already been called and assembled. Keep in mind, the bride and the guests are two different groups of people. The bride is whom? Us, the church. Everybody who's come to Christ in the period of the church age. That is the bride. Who are the guests? Say it louder, Bob. Okay. All of those Old Testament saints who have died before are invited to come. And yes, the heavenly host will be there. Everybody else that's in heaven will be there. But primarily, we are the bride. The church is the bride. Everybody else that's there is going to be the guests. They're invited. Now, I said there was good reason to believe that this is going to happen the way that it is, and that is because again, the wedding, the second step of this whole thing doesn't take place at the home of the bride. This is the established custom. Hold the wedding at the house of the parents of the groom. He goes, he fetches the bride, and he brings her to his house where the bridal table and chamber are ready. And in harmony with that custom, Jesus indicated that after preparing the living accommodations for his bride in his Father's house, he would come again. He would receive the bride to himself so that they could be together in the Father's house. He didn't say that he would come and join his bride. All right? He said he would come and take his bride, to snatch his bride away. We sang it this morning. So that he could be so that they could be together. So this marriage custom connects with what Jesus teaches, and it indicates that the rapture of the church, the marriage of the Lamb, will not take place at the second coming. Because at the second coming, where's Jesus going? He's going to the earth. He's going to the Mount of Olives. Okay? And he's going to rule and reign over the earth. He's not going to the Father's house. So you wouldn't take a bride somewhere else. You take him to the Father's house. That was the custom. His second coming, he's not going to return to the Father's house in heaven. Instead, he's coming to the earth. The rapture of the church and the marriage of the Lamb take place sometime before the second coming of Christ and has to be separate events from the second coming. Now, Secondly, another thing that we need to drill down on here is that in Bible times, marriages were joyous occasions, celebrative occasions, festive occasions. The taking of the bride by the groom was characterized with mirth and gladness. And Jesus indicated the same thing when he emphasized that it's impossible to mix the joy of a wedding with the mourning of a funeral. He talks about this in the Gospels when he compares the two. So we have to keep in mind that the mood that is going to be present, the mood that is going to be present at the second coming of Jesus is going to be just the opposite of joy and celebration. Because the description of the second coming in Revelation 19, as we read on, portrays Jesus not coming as a happy groom. He's not coming with joyful companions to take his bride to the Father's house. He is coming as a terrifying warrior king, coming with the armies of heaven to administer judgment and death upon a rebellious humanity. So the marriage customs of the times of the Bible provide a very festive marriage supper for the guests. The second coming is going to provide a radically different kind of supper. There's going to be a funeral supper of the dead flesh for the fowl of the earth. You can read about it in verses 17 and 18. And since Jesus taught that it is impossible to mix the joy of a wedding with the mourning of a funeral, and since the second coming is going to produce death for a great mass of humanity, we certainly are fair to conclude that the marriage supper of the Lamb is not going to happen at the second coming. The rapture of the church, the marriage supper of the Lamb take place sometime before that. And those events have to be separate from the second coming. Now, again, thirdly, taking the third point and making it a little bit more expansive. It's customary for the supper to be held at the home of the groom or his parents, not the home of the bride. The groom would escort the whole wedding party, including the brides and her companions, to his father's house for the marriage supper, that feast normally given by the father of the groom. All right, we do it differently in our culture. Now it's the father of the bride that gets stuck with the bill. Okay? But in those days, it was the opposite. And Matthew 22, Jesus indicates the same thing. So concerning the location of the marriage supper, the old tradition points to the house of the groom's parents. And that is exactly what Jesus indicates. It's going to be at the Father's house in heaven, not at the bride's house on the earth. So that mitigates against an earthly marriage supper. It's going to happen in heaven, not on the earth. Fourthly, the marriage supper began the same night that the groom took the bride to the father's house and consummated the marriage physically. So after the marriage was consummated, the groom announced the consummation to his friend who was standing outside the bridal chamber. Now we think about this and we say, oh, this is kind of gross. This is kind of personal, you know. I mean, he's this guy whose job is to stand outside the door and for the groom to kind of whisper and say, all done. Okay? And then he announces it to everybody. That's his job. Hey, it's all done. They did it. Okay, sorry, but that's the way it was. So thankful they don't have that today. Man, oh man. Can you imagine being picked for that job? Whew. So the announcement is delivered to the guests who already are assembled for the party. And they're waiting for the party to start, and after they have received the news, man, everybody starts feasting. Okay, pour the wine, pass the pork. Well, not pork, but pass the beef, pass the lamb, pass the goat. And off we go. And everybody begins to feast and to make merry, and they do this for a week. So the supper began shortly after they got to the Father's house, and in harmony with that, the marriage supper of the Lamb begins very shortly after Christ takes his bride, the church, to the Father's house at the time of the rapture. So the first thing we're going to do when we get to heaven is we're going to celebrate our marriage with Christ, and then everybody's going to party. Party, party, party. Can you imagine a party in heaven? How it must be, right? We're going to party, get on a fiesta forever, right?
When it speaks of the end of the age of the Gentiles, that period
the end of the age of the Gentiles. We're going to drill down on that a little bit more. Right off the top of my head, I would say that ends at the rapture. Because the church is gone, the church age is finished, and now begins the period of time where God picks up where he left off with the nation of Israel. That last 70, that last week of Daniel's 70 weeks. And there's about a month worth of days in between there, and we're going to talk about that next week. What are we going to do with these few days here and a few days there, and we've got to account for this time. So what are we going to do with it? So we'll talk about that more next time. Now, the rapture and the marriage take place before the second coming. The millennium begins after the second coming. And it appears that the millennium is not going to begin shortly after Christ takes the bride to the Father's house. So the marriage supper is not going to take place during the millennium. Point number 5. The Old Testament teaches that during the millennium there's going to be another marriage supper. Now, I just alluded to this briefly a moment ago. And this supper is going to be different from the marriage supper of the Lamb. The millennial marriage supper is going to be associated with the second marriage of God to the nation of Israel. Okay? Isaiah 25. Isaiah talks about this beginning in verse 6, and he describes the blessings of the future millennium. He says, "And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees." And that word for feast is the same used of a wedding feast. And it indicates that the wedding guests at this millennial marriage supper for God and Israel are going to be all the other people that are living in the world at that time. Isaiah is speaking of a future time after God's worldwide judgment when his people in Israel and other nations will feast together in peace and prosperity. That is during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And the background behind that is that the Old Testament teaches that God was betrothed to Israel. Both the nation, he bound the nation of Israel to himself as his wife. We see this throughout the Old Testament. All the prophets refer to this. All the prophets refer to the fact that Israel adulterated itself. Israel was not faithful to their vows, and on and on and on and on. We find that theme throughout, and so that is in very, very large part why Israel was thrown into captivity, etc. Israel repeatedly broke the covenant because of their spiritual adultery. So God divorced Israel, but not permanently. God also said through the prophets that there would come a time when he would take her back. And he did not regard the divorce as a termination of his marriage to the nation. Divorce might even be a strong word. Maybe we should say a separation. God has been judging the nation of Israel for its adultery. Ezekiel specifically is all about that. And through that judgment, he's going to stop Israel's unfaithfulness. He's going to calm himself from his fury and anger. He's going to lose his jealousy. And when Israel finally comes to the point where it repents in the future at the second coming of Jesus, God is going to cleanse the nation, Zechariah tells us. God is going to love it freely, Hosea tells us. God is going to betroth it to himself forever through the establishment of an everlasting covenant, Isaiah tells us, and Ezekiel. And Isaiah says that Israel at that point is going to be adorned like a bride. God will delight in and rejoice over Jerusalem as a groom rejoices over his bride, and the land of Israel will be married to God. So at the second coming, God and Israel are going to go through a betrothal and a marriage the second time, and that marriage supper is going to take place during the millennium, after the second coming. And I think oftentimes this is why people get it confused. Because they equate one and the same, and it's not. It's two different things. The future marriage of God and the marriage of the Lamb, Jesus, are two different things. There are two different brides. The marriage of God has the nation of Israel as its bride. The marriage of the Lamb, as we've already talked earlier, has the church as its bride. And it appears that these marriages have two different grooms, too. The marriage of the Lamb is Christ. By contrast, nowhere in the Old Testament is the Messiah presented as a bridegroom. So that means that the future marriage of God to Israel presented in the Old Testament has none other than God the Father in mind, not the Messiah as its groom. Okay? Two different marriages, two different grooms, two different brides. Now, what does that also help us understand as far as the heresy today known as replacement theology? Yes, yes. It very clearly and very loudly says to us that there is indeed a difference between Israel and the church. They are not one and the same. And anybody in today's movement called replacement theology says that the church has replaced Israel. The church is the spiritual Israel. No. And if you want to argue the point with somebody, argue with regards to this. There are two different brides, there are two different grooms, there are two different weddings that happen in two different periods of time. They are not one and the same. Big difference. There's one last question. I don't know that it's a major question, but there's a question that some folks have with respect to where Revelation 19 fits in the chronological order of Revelation. If the marriage and the marriage supper of the Lamb don't take place at the second coming and during the millennium, why are they mentioned in chapter 19 between the judgment of the great whore and the second coming of Jesus Christ? Okay, before and after. Why is it sandwiched in between that? There are a couple of possible reasons. First of all, very possible, John is being inspired as he writes Revelation to draw a contrast between the great whore with all of her impure unions and the bride of Christ with her pure union with Christ. To have that huge contrast be there. The second suggestion is that there is a contrast between the blessing of those called to the marriage supper and the judgment of the rebels during the second coming. All right? We are told, however, in verse 9 of chapter 19, that the guests who are called are those who will be blessed. And since the guests are not the bride, we have to conclude that the guests are not going to be part of the church. The bride is never a guest at her own wedding, is she? No. But since the guests are going to be blessed and they're going to be in heaven because that's where it's going to take place, they all have to be believers then, don't they? Sure. Otherwise, why else would they be in heaven? So the fact that the guests are going to be believers but not part of the church forces us to conclude that not all believers of all ages of history belong to the church. All right? There are some who would have us to believe, well, that everybody's the church. The church goes way, way back. All right. You can go far, but Moses, Abraham, all that. No. Old Testament saints are all going to be already assembled in heaven when the church arrives. And they're going to be there already at the time of the rapture. And they're the ones who are going to be the guests at this marriage supper of the Lamb. So, just kind of fun and interesting as far as looking at some of these things. We're talking again about an event that without any doubt happens at the rapture of the church is when the marriage will take place. The marriage celebration happens as soon as we get there. The party gets started. And the marriage supper of the Lamb is between Jesus Christ and the church. The marriage of God, the marriage supper of God, is between the Father and Israel. And that doesn't happen until after the second coming during the millennium. And as Bob said, when the remnant of believers is going to be reunited with God. The remnant of believing Israel is going to be reunited. Yep. That's us. That's us. Nobody will be afraid of horses. It'll be great. Okay? Yes, and as we get to talking about the second coming, we'll say more about that. All right? So we are plugging along and getting through some of these things. We are going to talk about some of the time factor stuff next week and probably get into talking about the second coming as well. So, hope it's clear as mud. All right, very good. See you later.